Today, I will speak about one of Manila's and, in extension, Southeast Asia's most influential composer, performer, and ethnomusicologist, Jose Maceda. However, I do not speak as an expert on Maceda. I speak as a scholar interested in how contemporary exploration of sound and sound performance practices in Southeast Asia offer proposals for new ways to understand epistemology and aesthetics, in which Maceda has opened the avenue through his avant-garde music projects. I also note that such experimentations were mostly made possible through the benefactory support of the Marcos government and the cultural diplomacies of the 70s and 80s Cold War politics. My original training is in theater making and music composition at the Philippine High School for the Arts. At the end of my art training, my mentor suggested that if I wanted to enrich my understanding of my practice, I should understand the philosophy and the historical trajectories of arts and aesthetics. Thus, while continuing to build a career in the Philippines in theater and music, I pursued a degree in art history at the University of the Philippines. That would also set the path for me to later pursue an academic career here in Europe. However, as a junior academic of color, from a post-colonial context, doing my work in the European Imperial Center, I underwent some paradigmatic shifts in my understanding of my positionality within the knowledge production system of Western universities. When I think about the institutionalization of artistic and musical practice and the universalization of European aesthetics through its canons and pedagogy, I am confronted by a rigged system. In theater schools in the Philippines, we would study James Brandon's Taxonomy of Performative Practices in Southeast Asia. This was published in 1997, wherein Brandon labeled certain performative practices as proto-theatrical, as if the European theatrical tradition is the Darwinist criterion through which all other performative cultures are evolving to become. As an artist studying canons and conventions, these epistemological structures shaped our aesthetics. However, the recent reshifting of theater towards the paradigm of performance provided for me a framework through which one could consider how to equalize the European canons with performative practices outside Western institutions. I find parallelism here in German art historian Hans Belting's work, where he also reframed art history into history of image. In my current research, I am taking the same methodology into my sound research and sound art project. I'm exploring how Western music constructed its hegemonic discourse through musicology by othering non-European sound cultures as they were historically recategorized from noise into music within the matrix of ethnomusicology in the academe and world music in commercial popular music. Hence, my work is sound studies and sound art overlaps at the very crossroads of my post and decolonial position. Within such sonic entanglements, I am inquiring on propositions for a hermeneutics of transcendental sound culture and practices. Jose Maceda's own artistic and musical trajectory resonates an opening in these epistemic shifts that I am attempting to trace. Maceda trained as a classical pianist in Paris and later completed his doctoral studies in ethnomusicology in the United States. In his engagement with the avant-garde music of Edgar Varese and Yanis Xenakis, he believed their works provided an aesthetics that transcended the constraints of Western musical ideological framework. It is through such musical iconoclasm and the use of Philippine indigenous sonic elements based on his ethnographic fieldwork that Maceda sought to search a medium of art music composition that represents the modern Philippine nation. In 1963, the year he completed his PhD in ethnomusicology at UCLA, Maceda premiered his first large-scale avant-garde composition, Ugma Ugma, roughly translated to English as Structures. In this piece for voice and a number of Filipino, Chinese, Japanese, and Indonesian instruments, he employed native taxonomic timbral interaction that was intended to showcase native Filipino conception of music. The sonic spectrum of this performance formed what Philippine ethnomusicologist Ramon Santos calls a human expression of musique concrète without the electronic component. In the works that follow, Agungun, a piece for gong sounds for 6 gong families in 1966, and Kubing, music for bamboo percussion and men's voices, Maceda continued with his aesthetics in what can be seen as his attempt to free avant-garde musical practices from their European forebears. To understand the milieu in which Maceda created his works, perhaps it is important to provide the socio-political context of Manila of the time. During the 1960s and early 70s, the state supported large-scale projects to the Marcos, who was the president at the time, large-scale projects to conduct ethnographic research of indigenous arts, music, dance, and performance cultures throughout the 7,100 islands of the Philippine archipelago. With Jose Maceda at the forefront of such project, his intertwined career as ethnomusicologist and composer culminated with the performance of daring massive avant-garde music and performance. Sponsoring these projects was the President Ferdinand Marcos and his wife, Imelda, an arts cultural benefactor. This perfect storm of scholarly aspiration and grandiose artistic projects was at the center of the Marcos tempestuous ideology of what is called the New Society. Such ostentatious enterprise must also be understood within the bigger scheme of a global cultural Cold War, where societies like the Philippines was imagining its future as a free society in a post-colonial capitalist world. So with these contexts for this presentation, I would like to revisit two of Maceda's seminal works, Ugnayan, premiered in 1974, and Udlot Udlot, premiered in 1975. I begin with Ugnayan. From Maceda's earlier exploration of native music as materials for live musique concrète, Ugnayan was the natural evolution of his thinking as he moved towards using recorded music. He envisioned this piece both as a challenge to Western art music convention and as a unifying populist musical expression. Ugnayan was originally performed on New Year's Day in 1974 under the patronage of the Cultural Center of the Philippines and with the support of the then First Lady Imelda Marcos. Ugnayan was performed through 20 Manila radio stations, which simultaneously broadcast sections of the piece. For each station, he prepared a unique set of village music sounds. To describe what this piece is about, I read from an official letter that was sent by barangay captains. These are the local, let's say, villages or smallest region in the city, and they sent letters to the residents of Metro Manila. And similar letters were also sent to residents of the nearby provinces of Rizal, Bulacan, Pampanga, Laguna, Bataan, Cavite. So the letter goes like this. Dear Barrio residents, the Cultural Center of the Philippines, in association with the government and private institutions, has the pleasure to invite you to the world premiere of a unique musical presentation, Ugnayan, a simultaneous broadcast by 20 radio stations, each playing one instrument of an orchestra, performing a musical composition prepared for this occasion. The 20 stations heard simultaneously over 20 loudspeakers will blend into a symphony to be heard on January 1, 1974 at the Rojas Triangle, Makati Avenue. The program will start at 3 to 6 p.m., while the actual broadcast will start at 6 to 7 p.m. So, if it wasn't clear, there are 20 radio stations broadcasting different parts. We will listen to an excerpt of Ugnayan now, but this recording combines into one track the different sections played from different radio stations. This will run for 20 minutes, so I will stop it here now, and I'll move on to my second case study. The second work that I would like us to listen to is Udlot Udlot, or translated as Hesitations, premiered in 1975. In this piece, Maceda explored the idea of community music making that involves large-scale participation. Udlot Udlot is an open-air ritual music theater for hundreds or thousands of performers. Variations of rhythmic drones are played on wooden percussion sticks, bamboo buzzers, bamboo stamping tubes, bamboo flutes, and voices. The voices sing drones of two short vocal phrases. One is descending slide, and the other a descending melody of 5 tones. In this work, Maceda explored musical ideas that invoke the sounds of nature, in which music identifies with nature at a time of increasing technology and commercialism. Ethnomusicologist Arsenio Nicolas describes the architectural structure of Udlot Udlot as a sharp human activity by as many people as there are present in one occasion, reminiscent of the atmosphere of rituals in villages, where people converged in the central square, in megalithic arenas, in rice fields, in sacred water springs and trees, in village temples or crossroads, in mountain sanctuaries, in ancestral graves and monuments where powerful spirits reside and preside over the affairs of humans. Udlot Udlot has been staged in cities in the Philippines, Indonesia, Japan, the US, and Germany. It has been performed in different spaces, contexts, and configurations. In 1980, it was performed in Bonn, and in September of last year at Savvy Contemporary in Berlin. The version in last year was a reduction of the original 800 performers in a public open space, and it has been reduced into a 30-participant ritual done in the Binnenhof of Archive Books in Berlin. And we could actually see an excerpt of this performance. So I now come to a very short analysis of these two works. On the capitalist side of the post-colonial world in the 1960s and 70s, an ethos of Western scholarship-trained artists drawing from the indigenous resources of their home country complicated the emerging cultural cosmopolitanism of Cold War era. In reflecting about the wider contexts of the avant-garde and the experimental art in the second half of the 20th century, it is now also good to expand, maybe it's good to expand the bigger arcs of contemporary Southeast Asian entanglements with global art history beyond the binary of colonial and post-colonial eras. Here, I lay down some initial thoughts on the period succeeding the formal decolonization of the Southeast Asian nation-states. We have a macrocultural history narrative of an international community framed by the United Nations promoting a unity of colorful diversity through emblematic cultural representations. In this matrix of a new global order, the newly independent former colonies were involved. Concomitant to this, we also have micro-histories of official nation-states drawing from their indigenous communities materials for their national identity building. Such cultural identity politics can almost be observed as a requisite to conduct international trade. Jose Maceda's ethnomusicological research in the 1960s and 70s helped create an archive of Southeast Asian indigenous sounds, which until today serves as an important resource of ethnomusicological scholarship. This archive also served as his own resource for his modernist sonic experimentations. So having one foot in the local nationalist art scene in the Philippines and in the global avant-garde with the other, he was strategically linking Southeast Asian metropolis to the bigger free market cosmopolitan art world. The combination of Maceda's training in the classical music world, his interest in the ethnomusicological fever of the 20th century, and the financial support of the Philippine aspiration for capitalist triumphalism strategically placed him at the forefront of the institutional and aesthetic habitus of the time. Within this historical background, I return to my question of sound and decolonization strategies. Can we ask, therefore, if Maceda's avant-garde music and performance practices resonate decolonial artistic strategies? How did his work resist the epistemic violence of the neocolonial structures of the Cold War system? Or to what extent did his aesthetics replicate the dominant imperialist system? In Ugnayan, the ubiquity of the transistor radio in 1970s Manila offered a medium to reimagine the indigenous communal rituals into the collective listening of residents of the Philippine metropolis. Using ethnic musical instruments composed in modernist soundscape, broadcast on 20 different radio stations, the completion of such sonic composition becomes the task of the listeners accessing the sound technology. In mass broadcasting, the individual becomes indistinguishable within a crowd. As ethnomusicologist Neil Mathern describes, quote, by participating in Ugnayan, the listener is simultaneously anonymous, inscribed in a social hierarchy, yet receiving an individualized message depending upon where she is standing and which way her head is facing, unquote. He further argues that the participants of Ugnayan within this crowd are simultaneously thrown into an ungrouped mass and temporarily unaware of each other's place in the social structure. The myth of class absence, so prevalent in Filipino identity construction, is simultaneously present and hidden. The telecommunicative fantasy is based on the assumption that the voiceless individual could speak to the oppressive power structure. In the second piece, Udlut Udlut, we again hear Maceda drawing from the minority arts as a pool of source materials. In constructing a musical representation of the modern Filipino, in such a musique concrète composition, Maceda employed the native sounds, I put native here in quotes, for their pure sonic value removed from their social contexts. I come back to Neil Mathern, who points out that they become empty signifiers robbed of their native value. The sounds simultaneously represent presence within and absence from the constructed Filipino nation. The very presence of native instrumentation compels the listener to place them in the nation of the nation and within a newly formed canon of Filipino sounds. So in the end, I think that Maceda stands at a position where he has opened the possibility of considering actually sound, giving the possibility for for decolonial possibilities. But but given the context of the 60s and 70s, which I've also argued about the Cold War and the post-colonial context of the Philippines and Southeast Asia, the aesthetics through which he was working with was still, I would argue, still a replication of a system in which he was deeply a part of. And so I think I'm running out of time, so I think I'd end with this statement. Thank you.
Wow. Good audience here. It's good to see a full room when talking on performance art. I've experienced differently. So this is great. First of all, I would like to congratulate and thank the organizers. The Goethe Institute, of course, Heinrich Hauswirth, thank you. And also Dr. Stefan Dreyer, who is here, from Jakarta, right? So thank you also. It's a very powerful institute and very transformative as well. I've personally experienced. So thank you for taking that on. Damian Lentini, of course, Eva Bencheva, and also Annie Jelkwan for organizing this and really putting these very striking topics together as well. And also, since we're here, those of you who were in the emails that were exchanged, I didn't respond to them. I would like to recognize and thank Okwe Emezor. He was not only a friend, but to me he was a mentor from the mid-1990s. In particular, his Johannesburg Biennale. Soon after, I started to work at the Gate Foundation with Sebastian Lopez, who was a good friend and colleague of his. I recall Sean Fisher as well. But also, Okwe was very uncompromising, radical, and transformative. And I would like to raise that as a spirit that I carry on. But it's also interesting to see how projects that we do gain critique as well. Okwe was very critical of Catherine David's Documenta when he was organizing the Johannesburg Biennale. But people like Busy Silva were very critical of Okwe Emezor as he was landing in Johannesburg. So let's take that criticality onwards as well. So now I want to talk on an ongoing project that sort of follows from an earlier project that I was working on, really the transformative years of my own research on performance art in China, working first in the Netherlands and then being almost forced to move to Australia because Australia was the place where one was accepted if one was studying Asian art. And those conditions led to a book on performance art in China, which I'm now self-reflecting upon and recently got the opportunity to be quite self-critical of that process as well. So I'll talk briefly about that too. Raising the question with regards to a project that I'm developing on performance art in Indonesia, not to say this is performance art in Indonesia, my previous book was called Performance Art in China, but more leading the title, When Was Performance Art in Indonesia? And this paper considers performance art as a complex field of performance-based practices, considered either through live art practices or through performance artworks conceived by artists who consider the mediated subject of the acting body in art, and indeed, as Damien was raising, the antagonism of that, and turning the medium of performance art into a complexity of performance media. To give that an introduction, beginnings and temporal ends, between 2001 and 2006, I studied that birth and development of performance art in China. And in hindsight, I studied a model of performance art similar to that of Rosalie Goldberg in her study of performance art from futurism to present, part of a world art series by Thames and Hudson. since 1979, and almost simultaneously published as Performance Live Art 1909 to the present by Abrams in New York. A seminal study, and also a study of canon-like proportions that sets out consciously or unconsciously to define performance art in terms of American and European performance, conditioned by artists who were leading the stage, emotions into environments and happenings, and ultimately into that condition of live art as the next logical step, as Goldberg says it. Pathways of, Goldway's present can be read as well in the art term description of performance art at Tate Online, raising explicit links to futurist productions and Dada cabarets. At least until recently, in 2016, when performance art is suddenly considered as, I quote, a set of questions and concerns about how art relates to people and the wider social world. This was discovered in 2016. I challenge that. It was referenced in terms of the art term and raised in research by Jonah Westerman, who is currently residing in New York. To give some reflections on the terms that we are using, I see performance very much as the noun, demarcating an action and also an activity. And then, and this is why it's at the top, I would like to highlight this condition of to perform. To perform is demarcating a direct action. It's the action to do. It's to act. It's inevitable. Performative, as an adjective, is highlighting a descriptive analysis, in my view, and the act of observing an action. So perfectly well for a researcher, maybe not for the artist who really feels the urge to perform. For me, performative describes the representational problems in art and art history. Performativity as a noun marks a linguistic turn and a way of action, but action through language. Similar to performative, performativity highlights observing, observation, not necessarily direct action. Sorry. Yes. Other conditions that define performance art, and have done so for a long time, and the problematics of really identifying that small circle where everything comes together of performance art, is that it's conditioned by art, it's conditioned by performance cultures, these days by these immersive, experiential, engrossed, the presence, the sensual conditions of what is then known as performance art. It could be live art as well, or could technically be kind of another art form, a very recent and very contemporary art form. And then performance. Performance linked to performance studies, performance linked to theater, to sound, to music, to all these transformations as well. And somewhere there is performance art, which also is an extensive network of discourses, of artists, of art festivals, and of practitioners who in various modes of exchange and in various modes of historical exchange encounter each other in that moment of really wanting to act, to perform, or else. When I was completing my own book on performance art in China, one of my editors remarked this, which became a quote in an article that I wrote for Broadsheet as well, questioning these conditions of performance art. He said, reading your thesis, I have this feeling of a wine bottle. And he said, performance art, in a way, is no more the art of performance than a wine bottle is a bottle of wine. In other words, meaning that performance art is an empty bottle, unless the art of performance art is being considered. A playful mode of practice. In my own study of performance in China, I was looking for the origins of performance art. I was making a Goldberg perspective on it. From the first manifesto and the street actions of the Stars Group to actions in the public space and artists wrapping themselves as living monuments. Here we see examples of the Stars, followed by a slide of Shaman Dada and a wrapping of Jang Pe Lee. The next slide, Shaman Dada on the left, Jang Pe Lee and Gung Jian Yi on the right. But with this, I'm currently wondering, with regards to Indonesia, can we find other trajectories as well? This paper will consider the history of performance art in Indonesia as a linking of examples of early happenings, of actions, to discourses and practice of performance art and performance art remediation in Indonesia. The paper will not establish a singular discourse or narrative on performance art. Such an approach I attempted and failed in 2010 when I wrote an essay on performance art in Asia, published with the Asia Art Archive, as a result of a 5-day symposium on performance art practices and documentation in Asia, titled Action Script. As I wrote recently in 2018 in a self-critical reflection published in Kunstlicht, how I ended up being rightfully criticized by many performance artists for my attempt to write a singular performance art history in such a vast and complex region. Instead of trying to present an art historical overview of performance art in Indonesia, there's an aspiration to reflect on a complexity of discourses and practices informing histories, narratives, and contemporary performance art. I'm using the term contemporary performance art in order to draw awareness of the important role of the contemporary art in relationship to performance and performance art, and in relationship to contemporary art in Asia. Addressing the problem of representation, furthermore, leads performance art to be rethought through performance traditions, as well as their contemporaneities. Discussions on the origins of performance art in Indonesia often links its start to the Indonesian New Art Movement, Gerakan Seni Rupa Baru Indonesia. In response to the dominant institutional context of modern art being limited to painting and sculpture, and initiating a new art movement featuring installation, assemblages, ready-mades, and some public interactions. First, in 1974, artists from Yogyakarta wrote a manifest in protesting the December 1974 Indonesia Big Painting Exhibition, predecessor of the Jakarta Biennale. Artists were Bonyong Mudiarni, FX Sarsono, Hardi, Nanik Mirna, and Siti Adiati. Sanento Yuliman, a young lecturer at the Bandung School, connected Jim Supangkat to these Black December artists. And then next, in early August 1975, the first exhibition of Indonesian new art at the Taman Ismail Marzuki, TIM, in Jakarta, the exhibition is seen as the start of a new art movement in Indonesia, linking to artists, the proto-curator Jim Supangkat as the important organizer, and also linking to a new generation of artists choosing to ignite installation and also potentially performance-based works. Combined with the continuing legacy of the artist, Jim Supangkat, and the idea that the origin of performance art could start with a manifesto and manifestations, that model of futurism to now, and is long seen as a medium of artistic expression that challenged conditions of representation in the history of art, the Goldberg model, the Indonesian new art movement can easily become a legendary context that prelude the development of performance art as beside installation art in Indonesia. Works that could be considered for including them into performative elements could be that by Bonyong Mudiarni, who made one of the earliest living sculptures, performance happening and art performances, for the second exhibition of Gerakan Seni Rupa Baru, or FX Sarsono, Pistol Krupuk, remade in 2013 for its participatory role. But more important is to look beyond, and to look at something like the artist collective Kepribadian Apa, What Identity, in 1977, at the Gedung Seni Sono exhibition space in Malioboro Street in Yogyakarta. On September the 1st, 1977, Bonyong Modiarni staged a performance happening and environment titled Hotel ASEAN Tower at the Senisoni Gallery space on Malioboro Street. The exhibition was titled What Identity and featured a group of self-organized artists who would later become known as the Pipa artists, named after the acronym Pameran Seni Kepribadian Apa. Artists included in the exhibition were Riz Purwana, Slamet Riyadi, Iskandar Surya Putra, Dedi Eri Supriya, Duriat, Sabto Radiardo, Warsito, Bonyong Modiarni, and others. They are featured in a catalog with extensive essays and statements on the artists and their works, written largely by Roland Mangulang. Bonyong Modiarni was also a founding member of the Indonesian New Art Movement, and additional members of the Gerakan Seni Rupa Baru who participated in the Pipa included Supriya, Sorana, and Manulang. They all joined the Gerakan Seni Rupa Baru, the New Art Movement, in 1979 after the last Pipa event, indicating a possible merger to stage a large exhibition at the Taman Ismail Marzuki in Jakarta. In total, 3 Pipa exhibitions are held in 1977, 78, and 79, all under the same title, suggesting a movement. But the artists were never considered as a group, unlike the Indonesian New Art Movement. The first exhibition, What Identity, was held from September 1st to September 6th. At the opening, Bonyong created an installation. He performed his Hotel ASEAN Tower, where he performed the role of a beggar and a construction worker, seated next to a sign that read, "I built the ASEAN Tower with contractor C.V. Suhartono." The exhibition, What Identity, was held without official permission. Instead, the artists had installed their works and closed down the main entrance door, hanging a sign that said, "Closed. Go to the nearest police station to enter the show." But they also left the back door open for people to visit the exhibition. Most significantly is the use of the phrase Pengalaran Seni, art performance, on the cover of the catalog for the Kepriya Badian Apa by Mangulan. The term pergelaran, as I found it, can be connected with pertunjukan and often is compared with drama, music, gamelan, and also traditional dance performances. With Pipa, it was used to explicate performance action in relation to art. 4 months later, in January 1978, Hardi, an important member of the Gerakan Seni Rupa Baru, staged a performance together with the renowned theater director Rendra, titled Coca-Cola Action at the Balai Budaya Theater in Jakarta. The event where the performance was held is discussed in an article in Tempo magazine on art and social protest by Bambang Bujono. The performance by Hardi and Rendra was to commemorate the Malari incident that occurred 4 years earlier in 1974. The Malari incident refers to the January 15 tragedy, when student protest riots in Jakarta on 15 and 16 January 1974 against corruption by the government, General Suharto, were violently crushed by the military. The protests were said to have been sparked by the state visit of the Japanese Prime Minister, Kakue Tanaka, followed by student protests, but they involved many poor and uneducated youth from Jakarta. The protests were crushed by the police and the military, killing 11 students. The exhibition where Hardi and Rendra performed Coca-Cola Action was shut down by a local command office of the military, Kodam. Contemporary performance art emerged in Indonesia somehow during the 1970s, during the time of the Orde Baru, the New Order regime. The 1970s must be seen as a time when contemporary writers, musicians, filmmakers, theater makers, contemporary artists started to consider new ways of reflecting on contemporary social realities, linking their works to urban culture and consumer culture, cultures of the everyday, and to new considerations on tradition and modernity, and on contemporaneity. Themes that emerge include cosmopolitanism and the environment, capitalism, state ideology, ordinary people, the cultures of the everyday, tradition and modernity. The 1970s and the 1980s are characterized by Virginia Matheson Hooker as marking a, quote, distinctive Indonesian voice in the arts, literature, and culture of the 1970s and 80s. Important for the current discussion, raising new entry points in the developing history of performance art in Indonesia. Indonesia is the position of theater resisting cultural and artistic hegemony. By the 1970s, official culture and identity was utilized by the state authorities and social elite under the New Order regime. Thank you. Barbara Hadley mentions images of noble grandeur and hierarchical social order serve to display and conform the authority of contemporary state and its officials. These include reconstructing core traditions to legitimize cultural power. The ensuing official cultural models, Hartley states, are set up to be absorbed and emulated or alternatively confronted and resisted. Confrontations and resistance first come in the form of theater productions that challenge cultural hegemony and that focus largely on Javanese core traditions and culture by connecting modern theater to culture and tradition of the poor people, the orang kecil, the ordinary people, orang biasa, and the village people, orang kampung, and their communities. Of great importance to these are theater makers, Arifin Charin, Nur Putu Wijaya, and important Rendra and his Bengal theater. Rendra was originally from Solo but moved to Yogyakarta in the early 1960s and studied at the Gadamaja University. Here, I draw attention to the Urukan clan campout on Panganites Beach south of Jakarta, an important mythical place. I'll skip this because otherwise it will be too long. But what is interesting is the condition in which Bambang Bujono, mentioned earlier, was riding on the Rendra and Hardy Coca-Cola action at the Balai Budaya. The report also states how the exhibition consists mainly of photographs of 1966 during the rise of Suharto. Bujono also writes how there is a photograph of Robi Chahyadi, aka Robbie C., who was on trial for importing luxury cars without paying duties. There were also photographs of special area of Jakarta, DKI-controlled teams performing curb control in the city. And furthermore, there were several copies of the Pioneer Jogja Daily. So what these things say is that the exhibition was highly controversial, but also highly active. Rendra was arrested in May 1978 during a poetry recital at the Taman Ismail Marzuki Cultural Center in Jakarta. First, an ammonium bomb was thrown into the audience, forming as a pretext for the military to enter and arrest Rendra. He was held for 9 months in solitary confinement without a trial. His arrest and confinement would lead Bengal theater to be dissolved. It would also lead a vacuum in community theater, which was hereafter filled by Theater Arena and Dynasty, which can be raised in another context. To conclude, writing a history of performance art in Indonesia, one can consider a complex range of entry points, including the possibility of a shift from theater into action in the 1970s, and artists of the Pipa Collective connecting action, performance, and art. Artists themselves continue to remind us, though, that the term performance art was not explicitly known until sometime during the 1980s, early 1990s, when curators brought with them new terms in contact with regional artist exchanges and exhibition. Most likely, the term performance art is not explicitly used in Indonesia until the 9th Jakarta Art Biennale in 1993. In the catalog of the Biennale, which describes artists using all types of forms leading to greater openness and public possibility in their work, including visual art, which is followed by a translation then of performance art, Pertunjukan Seni Rupa, in an article by Jim Supangat. Jim Supangat further points at the rise of performance art in the 1980s, as well as the earlier context of performance art in the 1970s, showing new aspects of theater. This paper has thought to provide further historical context, considering aspects of theater interaction, action into early considerations of the art of performance, Pengelaran Seni, and leading from the actions during the exhibition of the collective Pipa in 1977 and at Gedung Seni Sono to the Coca-Cola action by Hardy and Rendra in January 1978. Thank you.
Hello. Yeah, that's good. Well, Thomas, I'm really glad that I actually chopped up my paper as badly as I did, because we would be overlapping like crazy. So what I did by chopping up my paper, it's going to be a very general account, but I think it will help fill in a few gaps as description of certain projects that you didn't mention. First, I'd like to thank, of course, Eva Binteva for her lovely invitation, and also to Annie Jael Kwan, also for organizing this and being so kind and generous, including a lot of different people who have lots of different perspectives on performance art. And also to the Goethe Institute and to the Haus der Kunst, et cetera, and I'm not going to waste my time because everybody else has said this. So anyway, okay. Basically, today, like I said, I very quickly chopped up my paper. So what it is going to be is really a sort of a presentation, if you will, of or a general account of certain aspects of performance art, about their concepts that were presented. And one thing that is important for me in the long term, what I've been looking at in my research, which doesn't really come out that much in this paper, is the tracing of the transdisciplinary and the intermediality and the collaborative aspects of performance art. And I do this in a longer version that's not so choppy. So please forgive if some of the transitions are off. Today I am just going to look at a few groups, actually. I'm going to be focusing on a few projects from some artists in Bandung, which is in West Java. I'm going to particularly focus on their concepts and works that they made during the 1990s. Now, what Thomas did very nicely is provide a background by arguing some of the critical questions and the critical potentiality of the 1970s and 80s. So hopefully my paper, there will be some sort of nice connection there. Now, I argue actually that the 1990s was an important period in the history of performance art in Indonesia, because this is basically when the idea of performance art as experimentation, because a lot of people actually kept talking about it as seni experimental, or experimental art, and the word performance art was rarely used. So the 1990s is an important part, or an important point, where a lot of artists, not all, but a lot of artists decided that the idea of performance art as experimentation began to consolidate into something much more sustainable with social and spiritual intent. Now, this combination of social and spiritual intent is just one way, one perspective of looking at performance, and that's what I'm going to frame my work on today. So to varying degrees, a lot of the artists argued that their projects in practice are indifference to the direct and otherwise interference of government into the very fabric of private lives. such that there was an inscription and marking of the body itself. And in relation to the pathologies of modernization, because this was also a period of time in the 1990s where you have an increased step up in development projects, you have an increased step up in the process of modernization, and also you have a heightened scrutiny of universities, heightened scrutiny of the press and the media. So there were a lot of things going on at the time that would put pressure on artists to attempt to create new forms and also argue different positions, in this case, the spiritual and the social. So in West Java, well, actually, so what a lot of these artists are arguing for is that they suggest that through resistance to external controls might be enacted by submitting the body and the self to other external powers. And in some cases, this meant to those considered beyond human influence and perception. In West Java, some artists that I talk about, they actually use the word kesaktian. This leads to the eventual empowerment of self and society. As I articulate, many of the projects center around assumptions of the ability to tap into the forces and energies as a means of constructing new types of practice, capable of creating new social relations. I am going to argue, though, at the outset. I know that Tomas has given us the background of this wonderful background about this question about theatrical moving into action. But I'm also going to argue that performance art in Indonesia emerged specifically within visual art, that they took up concerns of the visual arts, at least the people that I'm going to be talking about here. So how do I just... Okay. I probably don't have enough time to talk about this piece. If I do, I will return to it. Okay. I begin by suggesting some of the strategies of a couple of works exhibited in the 9th Biennale that Thomas also mentioned, the 9th Jakarta Biennale in 1994. As he argued, the Biennale was basically a game changer in terms of the format of the National Biennale, and also how contemporary art would be discussed thereafter. Now, I bring this particular piece up because this is one of the 4 works of performance that were done the evening of the opening of the exhibition. This is Arahmayani performing in her space, 4 Faces, and I know that she's here, so I could be making a lot of mistakes, but okay. I want to have your feedback. So in this, we can see that Arahmani is wearing a costume of a long-sleeved white blouse and a Javanese pattern sarong, or the fabric, and dons an expressionless white mask. She etches a circle into a square mound of white sand with a black umbrella. The chime of a finger cymbal rung at regular intervals is the singular sound accompanying her as she weaves together gestures, a vast repertoire of traditional dance from Java and Bali. In this case, she's employing many movements that seemingly are associated with male roles. The resonating ping of the cymbal and the silent space in between is marking time. In a way, she performs this act as a kind of ritual cleansing. The remaining evidence of her performance, of her performed act, is the etched line in the sand and the imprint of her body. Just one of the representations and allusions to the double meaning of korban in the work. Korban in this case can mean both victim and sacrifice. Regarding the latter, the term refers to the transformative regenerative powers of submitting oneself to an external force. The work also refers to victim in the sense of a coercive external power that subjugates but gives little space for empowerment. Now, also on the opening night, another artist, Merintan Sherait, performed her Sound of Body in the main courtyard within the space of Andarmanik's installation, sculptural work, Crackling. Now, I'm not going to go into this because I do realize that tomorrow, actually, Sally Oy is going to be speaking about Merintan's work. I just want to say that in the Sound of Body, sound in this case becomes the embodiment, but also becomes a performed image. So I began with these two works because of their similarities and personal connections. By the time of the 9th Biennale, both of them were already known for their performance and other visual artworks. But they were also former members of the then defunct Sumber Waras, which was a group of academy students who came together under the name of Sumber Waras, or the Source of Sanity. The group itself was founded in 1988, and its members included Andramanik, Rahmayani, Dianto, and Isa Perkosa. They were a strictly on-campus group. That is largely because a lot of student activities were highly monitored, and so a lot of the activities had to be on campus. It would be very difficult to create groups off campus. So in Sumber Waras, they actually focused on investigating the relationship between the body in motion, and its environment as the core to a visual artistic practice. In this regard, they experimented with ways in which the body itself can interact with the physical object in a different way, to treat the material world and objects as extensions or parts of themselves. And so this is some of their experiments that they took as a group together. The group disbanded after only a year, and many of its members, though, continued to develop these ideas that I've discussed so far in very general account. So one of the artists that actually continued to follow up on some of the basic ideas of Sumber Waras was Isa Perkosa, who founded Parenkel Jahe in 1991 while still a graphics student. The term Parenkel Jahe was already in circulation during the 1970s among experimental theater groups in Bandung. The name evokes the twisting forms of the ginger root and its undulating shapes. It began as a form of resistance to established orders and later took on a more critical and socially relevant aspects. However, he argues that at the beginning, Parenkel Jahe was always just about the body. The idea of making something called performance art was not what it was about. More important was cultivating the self, vis-a-vis working through the body as movement, a kind of transcendentalism, end quote. So these are different examples of some of the Parenkel activities. So basically, I'm running out of time. Parenkel Jahe emerged at a time of increased military action and interference from state and local authorities regarding freedoms of speech. Inherent then in their actions, in Parenkel Jahe's actions, was a felt sense of urgency to construct a public space as a space in which artists are difficult to in which acts are difficult to capture, but could potentially trigger change, with the body as the conduit of direct communication without words. Hence the value of the unexpected, shocking, and the act of defamiliarization. So the performers interacted with the space, they interfered with its normal activities, but really rarely Parenkel Jahe ever really involved the spectators. They were bystanders, essentially, and we can see the looks of bemusement and amusement on their face. By the 1990s, actually, some of these groups, how do I get back? Oh, I don't. Some of these groups are actually starting to collaborate with non-academically trained artists. And this is actually really important because even during the 1970s up until the mid-1990s, there was still a hierarchy in artistic practice. So Parenkel Jahe, Isa Perkosa began working with the likes of Gerbang Bawah Tanah with its driving force of Nandang Gawe. I'm gonna skip that. Okay. Another group, or the last final group that I'm going to talk about is Jeprut. Actually, it's not a group as much as an attitude and a process. According to Tisna Sanjaya, who was a driving force behind Jeprut, Jeprut as an artistic practice is akin to the moment at which rice turns from raw state into cooked rice into porridge. In other words, it is the moment when something changes its state of being. The main objective was to distance oneself from the making of material objects and instead move art towards process, basically art to be process. Obviously, there are lots of connections between Sumber Waras and Prenkeljahe and Japrut, and a lot of their members actually overlapped. So what I would like to do, because I would like to actually go and discuss as a case study actually, Sanjaya's concept of Japrut, in which he actually injects Japrut with a profound spiritualism grounded in Islamic beliefs regarding social responsibility. For him, the artistic practice is something like a long pilgrimage or ziarah panjang, in which making art is a spiritual act and one's practice should be attuned to taking care to preserve the oneness and unity between God, humanity, nature, and the soul. So as I use as a case study in this regard is his long-term project in Tumbu, Instalasi Tumbu, or Installation of Growth, which I think exemplifies his philosophy, and he began this project in 1996, and I will stay with these initial stages. So what he did was he worked with a number of people. It takes a lot of people actually to carry out some of his projects, especially in Tumbu Instalasi or Instalasi Tumbu. In this, I beg your pardon. He invites people to rethink and remember the rhythm of nature as a counterbalance to the rapid speed of modernization, end quote. In this way, Sanjaya's performative work is part religious, ritual, and ritual of the everyday, part sociological research and community action. His intent is to bring Islamic values and beliefs of social responsibility together with artistic process to literally plant the seeds for sustainable and effective cultural action and movement. This is clear from the initial Instalasi Tumbu, in which the artist and his collaborators gave away 99 mahogany and melinjo saplings. The number 99 is significant in Islam for the number of sacred names of Allah. The chosen types of trees in this case were to be planted were also symbolic. The fruit of the melinjo are edible, hence nourishing, and the wood of the mahogany is hard and strong, hence capable of protection. He also chose the two kinds of trees because for him, they represent what he likens to a marriage. So prior to their distribution, the saplings are prayed over, as we can see in this image. This is Wawan Hussein, one of his longtime partners in Japrut, basically blessing the saplings before they go out into the world. As I said, this involves the collaboration of several people, or what Tisna calls fellow Japrutuan, such as Nandangawe and Prakasa that I mentioned before. And they also play a specific role in the division of labor. They all had different tasks. One of them was to actually take the saplings around, help people plant them, find somebody to adopt them. Each person adopting a tree was then asked to give a kind of message that is then recorded and written onto discarded board and sheet metal attached to a pole. Some of these messages, memories, and poems were then planted alongside the adopted tree. But some of them, as we can see in this image, some of them were taken to be planted elsewhere, as in the case of this Taman Shair, or Garden of Poems, where they were planted in a vacant lot that once had trees, but they tore down the trees and now it was a vacant lot, overgrown grass. So these encounters with the people in the collecting of their memories, their memories of nature, if you will, or even trees, these encounters are a form of Wachana Rakyat Jalata, or a common people's discourse. And the material objects that serve as documents of that exchange, in this case, trees, memories, and poems, produce what he calls an installation of thoughts and a space of zikir, or remembering the Almighty. Now, in a key sense, the works such as this One of the critical positionalities is via the evocation of nostalgia and the underscoring of loss. This is a different project, and I will end, actually, I have 2 minutes? Okay. This is, I wasn't sure if I would have time to talk about this piece, so that's why I just sort of left it to the very end. This is a project that he has been doing as well. He continues to do it to this day, but this, again, is a beginning in 1996. It is called, this one in particular is called, as well as the beginning slide, I'm going to get to the beginning slide. It's called Air Kaki Ibuku, which means the water from my mother's feet. In this work that I said it was made, keep going. Oh, there we go. This work, I had the luck to actually curate this work for the exhibition Taboo and Transgression in Contemporary Indonesian Art in 2005. This work is made up of simple elements of discarded wood. We have the Indonesian flag and a bottle of water fastened to the front. He ritually cleansed his mother's feet, then his wife's, and then his children's, as an act of humility, deep respect of what he calls, what in Indonesia is called pengabdian, or the dedication and devotion to both a spiritual and humanitarian level. The used water then was preserved in individual bottles. He continued the same process with art circles and other people in the community. Dozens of bottles were collected as individual prayers. So somebody else, actually Edwin Urians, has dealt with this process as the artist has brought it into 2018. And so I really recommend, if you're interested in that, I would read his third text article. But like I said, I'm actually sticking with the basically the very earlier works. This project was begun simply because the artist was talking about pengabdian. And part of this is that, taking care, like I said, of the oneness and unity between God, humanity, and soul, nature and soul. And so in this particular case, the general argument was as a healing process against violence of all kinds on a global scale. However, increasingly, the work became a lot more specific. In this case, beginning in 1998, he started collecting these prayers, if you will, and started performing more of these washing of the feet. In response to the violence that had erupted, the intensification of racial and religious tensions in Indonesia, beginning in 1996, but definitely erupted and exploded in 1998. And so in this case, this is actually his protest against the violence and an attempt to create a process of healing. Because in this case, you have to understand the positionality of the artist who's actually washing the feet of strangers, and also the effect of the person getting their feet washed. So it's that relationship, that closeness, that he actually attempted to argue that that foreignness, that strangeness, that potential enemy, then you become very close to them. It becomes a personal relationship. And this is what he was hoping to do. So here we've got, he is, am I over time? Okay, 2? Okay. I know that this is just, I've been very descriptive about this piece. I'm still working on ways in which to discuss it, because it really is it is very much based in Islamic values of pengabdian. And in this particular case, what he did, he went to different places, worked with different communities, Muslim, Christian, etc., different ethnic groups. And as you can see here, he's actually doing the ritual cleansing of their feet as part of a public performance. And in this regard, what he was attempting to do, like I said, was to help tamper down the fear of the unfamiliar, the fear of the stranger, by bringing them closer, with this very humbling process of washing the feet, because it also argues extreme respect for the person whose feet you wash. So I think that's all I've got. And I know this was highly descriptive. It's not based in theoretical aspects, but hopefully I filled in some gaps.